The day I found out I was worth $2 million was the same day I found out my husband had already decided I was worth nothing. It started with a phone call from a lawyer I'd never heard of. His name was Jeffrey Hartwell, and he said he represented the estate of my father, Edward Kowalski. I hadn't spoken to my father in 11 years, not since the night he told me that marrying Nathan was the biggest mistake I'd ever make, and I told him that if he couldn't support me, he could stay out of my life. I was 32 when he died. I didn't even know he was sick. Jeffrey's voice was careful and measured in the way that lawyers' voices always are. He said my father had passed 6 weeks earlier from pancreatic cancer, that he'd been diagnosed 18 months ago, that he'd spent the last year and a half putting his affairs in order. He said my father had left me his commercial property in Kelowna, 2 investment accounts, and the house he'd built in the Okanagan, all of it tallying to just over $2 million. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. I was standing next to the counter, and then I was sitting, my back against the cabinets, still holding my phone, listening to Jeffrey tell me there were documents to sign and that I'd need to come to his office in person. I didn't cry. I just kept thinking. He knew. He knew he was dying, and he knew where I was, and he chose to wait until he was gone to reach out. I wasn't sure if that was cowardly or kind. Nathan got home late that night. He came in smelling like cold air and something else I'd learned not to name, dropped his jacket over the back of the dining chair the way he always did, even though we'd had that conversation 100 times. He looked at me across the kitchen and said, "You look like you've been crying." "My father died," I said. He stopped. "Your father?" 6 weeks ago, apparently. I just found out today. He said he was sorry. He put his arms around me and said the right things, and I stood inside that hug feeling hollow. We'd been married for 7 years. There had been a time when that hug would have been enough. I'm not sure exactly when it stopped being enough. It wasn't one moment, more like a slow leak, the kind you don't notice until the tire is flat and you're already stranded. I didn't tell him about the inheritance. Jeffrey had mentioned carefully that I might want to consider speaking with a family lawyer before making any financial decisions or disclosures. "It was just a suggestion," he said. "Just something to think about." I thought about it all night while Nathan slept beside me. The next morning, I called a family lawyer named Patricia Osei, who a colleague at work had used during her divorce. Patricia had an office in downtown Vancouver, on the 12th floor of a building that smelled like fresh carpet and air conditioning. She was direct and she didn't waste time, which I appreciated. She asked me how things were at home. I told her they were fine. Then I looked at her and changed my answer. "I think he's been seeing someone," I said. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. I don't have proof, but there have been signs. For about a year, maybe longer. Patricia nodded, like she'd heard this 1,000 times, which she probably had. She told me that, before I signed anything, before I told Nathan anything about the inheritance, I should get a clear picture of where things stood legally in my marriage. She asked if I'd signed any joint financial agreements recently, or added Nathan to any accounts. I said no. He handled his finances, I handled mine, and we split the household expenses down the middle. We'd agreed on that early on, and it had always seemed practical. Now it seemed like the one smart thing I'd stumbled into without meaning to. She said that was good. She said she'd look into a few things and get back to me. I went back to work. I'm a structural engineer with a mid-sized firm in Burnaby. I've been there 9 years, long enough to have my name on the door, and short enough that I'm still the one doing site visits in the rain. I like the work. I like that problems have solutions, that you can calculate what something can and can't bear, that the math doesn't lie to you. People are less predictable than load calculations. My colleague at work, Sandra, who sat across from me and had known me since I started at the firm, could tell something was off. She brought me coffee without being asked and sat on the edge of my desk and said, "You want to talk or you want me to pretend I didn't notice?" "Both," I said. She laughed and went back to her desk. I spent 3 weeks going through the motions: work, home, dinner, sleep. Nathan was distracted in ways I'd learned to recognize, his phone face down on the table. A pause before he answered simple questions, a kind of careful cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes. I recorded nothing. I said nothing. I waited for Patricia to call. She called on a Thursday morning, just before 9. I was in my car in the parking lot at work. She asked if I was somewhere I could talk privately. "Yes," I said. "I need you to go to the Land Title and Survey Authority website and look at the property listed under your address," she said. "Can you do that right now?" I pulled out my laptop. My hands were steady. I don't know how. I navigated to the site, entered the address of the house Nathan and I had bought together 4 years ago, the semi-detached in East Vancouver that had taken everything we had as a down payment. Nathan's name was the only one on the title. I stared at the screen. "That's wrong," I said. "We bought it together. I have the purchase agreement. I signed the mortgage documents." "You signed the original mortgage documents," Patricia said. "There was a refinancing 18 months ago. The new mortgage documents list only Nathan as the owner and borrower. I didn't sign any refinancing documents." There was a pause. "No," she said. "You didn't." I thought about the stack of papers Nathan had put in front of me one Sunday afternoon, saying the bank had needed updated signatures on some account maintenance forms. Could I just sign where the tabs were? I'd been on the phone with a contractor at the time. I'd signed. I opened my mouth and closed it again. "There's something else," Patricia said. "I asked you to bring your marriage certificate to our first meeting. I had it verified. I need to ask you something directly, Claire. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." I noticed she'd caught herself mid-name. I thought that was strange, but I filed it away. "When is the last time you remember signing a document for Nathan that you didn't fully read?" she asked. "The Sunday afternoon, the account maintenance forms." 18 months ago, I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need you to come into the office today. Can you do that?" I called Sandra and told her I had a family emergency. She didn't ask questions. I drove across the bridge and parked in the same garage as before, and took the elevator to the 12th floor, and sat down across from Patricia, who had a folder open on her desks, and her hands folded on top of it. She told me she'd done a routine cross-check of my legal status as part of preparing the inheritance paperwork. She said that in British Columbia, marital status affects how an estate is administered, and so she'd needed to confirm. Then she told me that according to provincial records, I had been legally divorced for 4 months. I heard the words. I processed them individually. Divorced. 4 months. I sat with them for a moment, the way you sit with something that makes no sense, waiting for it to resolve itself into something that does. "That's not possible," I said. "I haven't filed for divorce." "Nathan did," she said. 14 months ago. The proceedings concluded 4 months ago. The settlement documents bear your signature." I thought of the Sunday afternoon, the account maintenance forms. Patricia slid a photocopy across the desk. I looked at my signature on a separation agreement, on a statement of Family Law Act compliance, on a final divorce order. My signature, on all of them. I recognized the shape of my name. I did not remember writing it there. "He forged my signature on the house refinancing," I said. "The signatures on the divorce documents match your known signature closely," Patricia said. "But there are questions. Given what you've told me about the refinancing, and given the timing, I've already spoken to a colleague who specializes in family law fraud. She thinks there's enough here to file a complaint with the Law Society, in addition to pursuing civil remedies." She leaned forwards slightly. "Here's what I need you to understand right now," she said. "You are not legally married to Nathan. You have been living in a house that was transferred out of your ownership without your knowledge, and you are about to come into a significant inheritance. Those 3 facts together are the reason I am asking you to be very careful about what you say and to whom until we have a strategy." I nodded. I was surprised by how calm I was. I think my body understood before my mind caught up that falling apart was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I drove home. Nathan was still at work. I walked through the house slowly, looking at it differently, looking at it like what it apparently was, which was not my house. I'd painted the hallway myself, that pale gray green we'd argued about, because he thought it looked cold, and I thought it looked calm. I'd refinished the floors in the back bedroom. I'd planted the garden in the backyard every spring for 4 years. None of it was mine. I made dinner. I set the table. Nathan came home and said it smelled good and told me about a meeting he'd had and asked about my day. I said my day was fine. I watched him pour himself a glass of wine and settle into his chair, and I thought, he does not know that I know. And I thought, how long has he been sitting across from me at this table, knowing that I didn't know? His mother, Darlene, called that weekend. She was the kind of woman who communicated through implication, every question containing a smaller, sharper question inside it. She'd never thought I was good enough for Nathan, not because of anything she'd said directly, but because of what she'd never said. She'd never called me her daughter-in-law. Just Nathan's wife. And before that, Nathan's girlfriend. Always at a distance, always on loan. She called to invite us to Thanksgiving. I said we'd be there. Nathan looked up from his phone and smiled. I smiled back. On Monday, I met with Patricia and her colleague, a woman named Dr. Felicity Okafor, who did forensic document analysis and had testified in provincial court 37 times. Dr. Okafor reviewed the divorce documents and the refinancing papers and told me she could identify at least 3 points of inconsistency in the signatures that she would classify as indicative of forgery rather than natural variation. She said she would prepare a formal report. Patricia said we had 2 options. We could move immediately, file complaints, apply for an emergency injunction to freeze Nathan's assets, go to the police. Or we could move carefully, gather more evidence, establish a fuller picture of what he'd done and when, and then act in a way that didn't give him time to protect himself. He doesn't know you know, she said. That's your advantage. Once he knows, that advantage is gone. I thought about Haley in the story I half remembered from somewhere. Some situation someone had told me about once. The woman who'd been told the same thing and hadn't listened, who'd confronted her husband before she was ready and paid for it. I decided I was not going to make that mistake. We do this carefully, I said. Over the next 6 weeks, Patricia and her team built the file. They traced the paper trail on the house refinancing. They found that Nathan had opened 2 investment accounts I'd never heard of in the months following our supposed divorce. They found that he'd applied for a mortgage on a condo in Langley, a mortgage application that listed his marital status as single. They also found Simone. Simone was 30 years old. She'd been working in Nathan's office for 2 years. The condo in Langley was listed under both their names. I can't tell you what that felt like, exactly. It wasn't a surprise in the way that surprises feel. That jolt, that sudden intake of breath. It was more like when you've been carrying a weight for so long that you've forgotten you're carrying it, and then someone finally takes it out of your hands and you feel the absence of it, the shape it had made in you. I called Sandra from my car, in the same parking lot where Patricia had first told me. I didn't tell her the details. I just said that my husband was not who I thought he was. And Sandra, who had always said less than she knew, said, I know, sweetheart. I've known for a while. I didn't know how to tell you. How long? I said. Since the Christmas party last year. He came with someone and told people you weren't feeling well. I sat with that for a while. The meeting happened on a Friday in November, 3 weeks before Christmas. Patricia had arranged everything. I had arranged nothing except myself. Nathan came home at 6:30. I was in the kitchen. I had set the table, made dinner, poured wine. He hung up his coat, on the hook this time, I noticed, not over the chair, and came in looking tired but pleased with himself. This looks nice, he said. Sit down, I said. He looked at me. Something shifted in his face, very slightly. Everything okay? I set my phone on the table, screen up, recording. I'd been advised to do this. I did it. I want to ask you something, I said, and I want you to answer me honestly. He sat down. He reached for his wine glass. Are we still married? I said. He went, Nathan, I said. Are we still married? He put the glass down. I watched him decide what to do with his face. I could actually see it, the calculation, the decision. Why are you asking me that? Because I'd like to know, I said. Claire, he started. I need a yes or a no. He looked at the phone on the table. He looked at me, and something in him seemed to understand that the shape of this moment had already been decided, that the only question left was what he chose to do inside it. No, he said. We're not, I nodded. When were you going to tell me? I was going to. He stopped, started again. I thought it would be easier this way. I thought if we just... You forged my signature, I said. On the divorce documents. On the house refinancing. You transferred our home into your name without my consent and then filed for divorce using documents I never signed. He stood up. You don't know what you're talking about. I have a forensic document analyst who disagrees, I said. I also have Patricia Osei on retainer, who has filed a complaint with the Law Society of British Columbia on my behalf, and who filed a report with the RCMP this morning. Nathan's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It went blank. Not angry, not panicked, just blank. Like a light going off. You should also know, I said, that I inherited $2 million from my father last month. My father, whose estate was administered by a lawyer who verified my marital status before distributing assets, and who found something interesting. I picked up the phone, stopped the recording. You divorced me 4 months ago, which means you have no claim to any of it. He sat back down. He looked like a man who had been running and run out of ground. The condo in Langley, I said. The accounts you opened after the divorce, Simone. I said her name clearly and watched his jaw tighten. I'm not here to yell at you. I'm here because I needed to look at you while I told you that I know everything and that there is nothing left to hide. Darlene called 2 days later. She'd apparently heard from Nathan because she didn't bother with pleasantries. She told me I was being vindictive, that Nathan had made a mistake but that I was destroying his life, that families worked these things out without lawyers. Darlene, I said, I have been not your daughter-in-law for 4 months. I don't think you have any standing here. She hung up. The RCMP investigation took 7 months. Document fraud, in the case of the divorce papers and the refinancing. It wasn't a quiet process, but it was a thorough one. Nathan's firm did their own internal review when the news surfaced. He'd used a notary connection through a colleague at the firm to process the refinancing paperwork, and that colleague lost his desk designation. Nathan was charged. The proceedings are still ongoing. I'm not holding my breath for a particular outcome. The law moves slowly and in its own direction, and I've learned to let it. The house was returned to joint ownership pending resolution of the fraud investigation, and I bought out Nathan's share at assessed value. My lawyer negotiated it. I didn't have to sit across a table from him again. The inheritance cleared in January. I called Jeffrey Hartwell and told him I was ready to proceed, and he walked me through the transfer of the Kelowna property and the investment accounts. I flew out to see the house in the Okanagan on a Tuesday in February, a gray day with snow still on the hills, and the lake flat and pewter-colored below. The house was smaller than I'd expected. My father had been a practical man. It was built well, though. Solid foundation, good bones, the kind of construction that lasts. There was a garden out back that had gone unattended since he'd gotten sick, and I stood in it for a long time in my coat, looking at what the frost had done to it. I thought about calling him, for a moment, the way you think about things that aren't possible anymore. I didn't go back to the house that night. I checked into a hotel in Kelowna and ordered room service and watched the lake go dark from the window. I thought about the 11 years. I thought about what he'd seen in Nathan that I hadn't wanted to see. I thought about whether he'd known, somehow, that leaving me those $2 million was the thing that would finally set me free. Or whether it was just what you do when you love someone, and run out of other ways to say it. Sandra flew out for a weekend in March. We hiked up Knox Mountain, and she complained the whole way about her knees, and I told her she'd be fine, and she was. We ate at a place on the waterfront, and she ordered the salmon and told me I looked different. Different how? I said. Like yourself, she said. Like you again. I thought about that for the rest of the meal. I thought about the version of me that had stood in that kitchen and set that table and poured that wine. Doing everything right. Holding everything carefully. Trying so hard not to drop anything that I hadn't noticed someone had already walked off with the things that mattered. I put the Kelowna house on a long-term rental. I kept the investments where they were and let Patricia connect me with a financial planner she trusted. I went back to work, to the site visits in the rain, to Sandra's coffee on my desk, and the problems that had solutions and the math that didn't lie. It's been 14 months now. Some days are easy, and some days I drive home from work and sit in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before I go in. Not because anything is wrong, but because I need the moment to belong entirely to me before I share it with the rest of the evening. Some days I call my Aunt Petra, who is 71 and lives in Saskatoon, and knew my father better than I did. And she tells me about him in the small practical ways that are the most real. That he used to burn his toast every morning and not notice, that he kept every receipt he ever got, that he drove 3 hours to see her when her husband died, even though they hadn't been close for years. I'm learning him backward, from the end. It's not what I would have chosen, but it's something. The thing about structural engineering, the thing I've always loved about it, is that you spend a lot of time calculating what happens under pressure. Not if pressure will come. Pressure always comes. You calculate what the structure can bear, where its weak points are, what needs reinforcing before the weight arrives. I used to think I was calculating someone else's structures. It took me longer than it should have to understand that the whole time I was also learning about my own. I know where my weak points were. I know which ones I've reinforced. And I know, in the way that you know things after you've been through them, the way that's different from knowing them before, that I can bear more than I thought I could. That's not nothing. After everything, that's not nothing at all.